It is a privilege for me this morning to introduce our speaker. As I've been telling you for a number of weeks, he's my former boss, and I first met Kent Craig in 2006. I believe it was July of 2006 when we first met. I remember actually when it was. It was when we were at candidate class. We had to share our testimony, and we were like, at the time, I don't know if it's still the case, but at the time it was like the biggest candidate class that had ever come through the agency, and so I don't know, there were probably 150, 200 people. Now, for me, that's not a big deal. I don't mind speaking in front of people, but if you know my wife, then you know that was a big, big deal for her. And so we got out, we shared a testimony, and I think it went pretty well. And I remember kind of going to the back, and it was for my wife, it was like, that's all done. And we went to the back, and Kent Craig was one of the first people to come up and greet us and just talk to us a little bit and talk about some people that we knew in common, and just found him to be just a kind, caring, and passionate for missions kind of guy, and just I really looked up to him. He wasn't going to be my boss, at least at that time. I didn't know that eventually he would be, but through the years, as things changed, he kind of took over where we were, and so every couple of years we would see him in the Philippines, see him in Pennsylvania, and just have really appreciated getting to know him, and have really grown to love him. When Pastor Chris asked me if what I thought about inviting Kent Craig to come and speak, I was like, perfect. Let's do that. I would love to have him come and speak at our conference. So, Kent Craig is. I'll let him share his title, but he's like a regional director over everywhere. If you look over at that map, everywhere to the left side of that map over there, the world map, he covers almost all of that there on the left side, on your left side, on my right side, he covers all of that. So, Kent Craig, come and share with us.
Thank you, Mike. Deeply appreciate it. Well, Pastor Banks, thank you for the warm invitation to come to Daniels Road this weekend and to participate in your missions conference. That is indeed the region of the world where we serve. The title is too long for a business card. I didn't come up with it. It was given to me. Executive Director for the Asia Pacific, East Asia, and Oceania. If you draw a circle around that region of the world, it represents 60% of the world's population. There are more people living in that circle than outside of it. We have a long commute to work. And because of the obvious reason that you're all acquainted with, it's been a little bit over 2 years since we've been able to travel and to visit with our missionary team members there. They shared our background. We were teammates focused on East Asia together. It's been a delight to get to know the Banks family before they came to shepherd you here at Daniels Road Baptist Church. Our connections with the Hendels date deep into the past, with his role with the GRBC in forming international partnerships and encouraging national leaders around the world, also as an ABWE board member. And then their kids, Jeff and Jody Demerly, commissioned by this church years ago. The Lord deployed, much like he did in Acts chapter 13, the church at Antioch. He chose one of his best to send from your church to Slovakia. And Jeff has demonstrated tremendous faithfulness. Jody, godly wife, serving very effectively at their side, and God has enlarged their scope of ministry, given them greater responsibility. His office is directly across the hall from mine. And so we really feel like we have a lot of acquaintances, and it's been great to make new friends yesterday and today here at Daniels Road Baptist Church. I want to mention the Lethbridges also. What a valuable contribution they make in resourcing ABW ministries around the world with properties and facilities. Really a crucial part of what we do there. Will you turn with me this morning to John chapter 4? We're going to be looking at verses 27 to 35. John 4 is a familiar passage of Scripture for those of you that have walked with the Lord for a while. It's the story of Christ's conversation with the Samaritan woman at the well. One of the most familiar parables of Jesus featured a Samaritan. We find it in Luke chapter 10, the parable of the Good Samaritan. One of his most famous miracles is found a few chapters later in Luke chapter 17 when he healed 10 lepers. And we read within that account in verse 16, it's almost just a footnote, an added thought, an afterthought, that Jesus said that the one that returned out of the tent to thank him, by the way, he was a Samaritan. The third dimension of the Acts chapter 1 and verse 8 articulation of the commission, where Christ commanded his disciples to be witnesses in Jerusalem and in all of Judea. The third dimension was to be witnesses in Samaria and to the ends of the earth. His first revelation as the Messiah. Who did he first inform that he was the anointed one, the appointed one, the sent one to be the messianic deliverer of Israel? Who was that individual that he chose to first reveal his true identity to? It's right here in John chapter 4. It was the Samaritan woman. In fact, every time we read about this overlooked, neglected, unreached people group from the perspective of Jesus, it was always in a complementary context. Today we're going to look at John chapter 4, verses 27 to 35, at the story of the bad Samaritan. You and I must be available to take the gospel to all people, to target unreached people in unevangelized places. Have you ever experienced the frustration of unavailability? You're going to a pharmacy to fill a prescription, and they're out of that particular medication. You have a list of supplies, and you're at the hardware store, and the clerk tells you we're out of stock of that, we don't have that, we don't have this. You're working on another project. You have a list of parts. You go to the auto supply store, out of stock. Perhaps in our contemporary day, you're pushing your cart down one aisle after another at the local grocery, and you see certain shelves that are just bare. The frustration of unavailability. We're going to discover today that ironically here in John chapter 4, the disciples in verses 27 to 28 caused frustration to the heart of Jesus Christ. They were unwilling to rise above the cultural prejudice, the social influences of the day. They were unavailable to be witnesses, to be disciple makers, to be teachers of the Samaritans. Does that still happen today? In our context, do we ever exhibit that? Do we frustrate the Lord of the harvest by our own unavailability? Verses 27 to 35 is really a parenthetical paragraph. Verse 31 begins with the transitional word meanwhile, or just after this. And it introduces us to the subplot that's here in John chapter 4. After the well-known dialogue between Christ and his encounter with the Samaritan woman in verses 1 to 26, there's a second, less familiar conversation that occurred between Jesus and his 12 disciples. In a novel series or in the film industry, writers, producers very often love to continue the story with what we call sequels, and we enjoy those. The first 26 verses of John chapter 4 record the dialogue between Jesus and the Samaritan woman. Just to quickly summarize it, that's not the focus of our text today, but what occurred in that conversation when we read in verses 4 and 5 that he targeted connection with the Samaritan woman by purposefully taking the shortcut and traveling directly through Samaria. Verse 6, he initiated the conversation by admitting, hey, I'm tired, I'm thirsty. He captured her attention in verses 7 and 9 by asking her for a drink of water. He stirred her anticipation by offering to her living water. Now he has her full attention. He disclosed her condition by revealing her multiple marriages and her immoral relationships in verses 16 to 18. Then he disarmed her attempt to evade by explaining to her and describing to her worship that truly pleases God. And then at the conclusion of the conversations, verses 25 and 26, here it is, he reveals his person, his identity, his mission as the Messiah to her. That's the dialogue. That's the first story in verses 1 to 26. And then the sequel story picks up in our text today in verse 27. And it features Jesus Christ conversing with his disciples. And today we're going to discover in the familiar words of Paul Harvey for the 50 and older crowd, we're going to look at the rest of the story. Verse 8 is a parenthetical verse that introduces the subplot. It records the seemingly insignificant fact that the disciples had gone into Sychar to buy some food. Now, this was a very small, remote, unimpressive town in Samaria. It doesn't even appear in most Bible maps. But the disciples had gone into Sychar to buy some lunch. So that footnote is going to become the focus point here in verse 27. When the disciples returned, the Samaritan woman departed. They likely crossed one another on the same path leading into Sychar. They're returning from Sychar with freshly baked bread to fill their hungry stomachs. She's racing back into town with newly discovered living water to quench the thirst of her townmates. And it's within that context that today I want us to be impressed from this account in John chapter 4 that we must be available to take the gospel to all people, both near and far. We must be available to target the unreached and unevangelized places. In John 4, 27 to 35, we're going to discover 3 ageless, timeless obstacles to being available to take the gospel to all people, to targeting unreached people and unevangelized places. You've all watched a track and field competition, 100-meter hurdles positioned between the starting blocks and the finish line are a series of obstacles, hurdles. None of the 3 that we're going to look at here in our text today slowed Jesus from invading and transforming this woman by his compassionate grace. We're going to see, on the other hand, that the disciples are going to trip and stumble over all 3. And I'm afraid that his followers today continue to have issues with the 3 that we're going to pull out of the text. What's the first? Number 1, prejudice is a hindrance to availability. And I'm going to summarize each of these 3 points in simply 2 words. Prejudice is a hindrance to availability, or more succinctly, not them. Not them. Look at verse 27. He has concluded his conversation with the Samaritan woman. He turns his attention to the disciples. Just then the disciples returned from purchasing bread in Sychar. And they were surprised to find him talking with a woman, but not one of them dared ask, "What do you want?" or "Why are you talking with her?" Prejudice is an obstacle to availability. Now, the spark that ignited this historical animosity between the Jew and the Samaritan, and the wall of division was firmly erected between the two. But it dates all the way back deep into the Old Testament. At the time of the invasions and the deportations, first of all, Assyria capturing the northern kingdom, and then later on Babylon and the southern kingdom of Judah. The foreign policy of both of those invading nations is that after they conquered and annexed new territories, that they would deport some of the finest captives back to their kingdoms, and then they would repopulate the occupied territories with nationals of their own. We read about that in 2 Kings chapter 17, verses 24 to 34. It gives a clear explanation of how they repopulated this region of Samaria, the Babylonians, with individuals after they conquered the region. And so if you turn a little bit further into the Old Testament, roll the clock forward about 70 years to Ezra chapter 4, chapter 5, 536 BC, when Zerubbabel returns at God's permission, God's command, in fulfillment of God's promise, to rebuild the destroyed temple at Jerusalem. The Samaritans came down from the north, and they made Zerubbabel an offer that he could not accept. Ezra chapter 4 and verse 1 identifies the Samaritans as, quote, the enemies of the Jews. That identity belies their offer, their invitation, when they said in verse 2, let us help you rebuild this temple to our God. And Zerubbabel, ironically, surprisingly said thanks, but no thanks. You intermarried with the Babylonians. You incorporated elements of their heathen, pagan religious system, idolatry, into your own worship system. You'll have no part in rebuilding the temple at Jerusalem. That's where it started. And it persisted throughout the centuries, all the way here to this context in John chapter 4. Who are we today prone to overlook and neglect? Who are people that we're tempted to bypass and avoid? Their lives are ruined by sin, and when we see them, we're prone to look the other way, cross to the other side of the street. We really don't want to interact with them. Again, verse 4, we read that Jesus had to go through Samaria. Those words were painful to the ears of the disciples because no one took the shortcut when traveling from Judea to Galilee in the north. In fact, the custom was to cross to the other side of the Jordan River, travel northward, and then cut back into the region to avoid contact with those despised Samaritans. But we read in verse 4 that Jesus had to go through Samaria. Verse 9, we read that the Samaritan woman then questioned Jesus. After he had met her, he was tired, he was thirsty, he would like a drink of water. She said to him, you are a Jew, I am a Samaritan woman at that. How can you ask me for a drink? Because Jews do not associate with Samaritans. Another translation puts it this way, Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. Interesting, the disciples, we read in the context, had gone into Sychar to buy bread from who? Samaritans. If that's not associating with Samaritans or dealing with Samaritans, I don't know what is. The original terminology that undergirds this translation, Jews don't associate with, they don't have dealings with Samaritans, literally means this: Jews do not share in common with Samaritans. What in the world is he talking about? Well, think about it. They're at the well. The bucket tied to the rope goes down, fills with water. They bring it up, empty water into a cup, and I'm sorry, but Jews don't share in common with Samaritans. He had her full attention at this point. In John 4, the Jews were unwilling to rise above the cultural prejudice, the social division that had divided the Jews and the Samaritans for centuries. who do they represent today? Several years ago, and my friends and colleagues mentioned the fact that we had 15 years of residential ministry in the Philippines and loved those years. We'd still be there today at ABW, not asked us to oversee our team of missionaries throughout Asia. But early in our time in the Philippines, we had a newly arrived couple, Gary and Becky Kuhn, K-U-H-N, and their 4 children that arrived in Manila just a couple weeks after their arrival in the Philippines, and they were staying at the ABWE guest house. Hendels have stayed overnight there as well. They were house shopping, acquiring furniture, getting ready to set up. Their kids were already enrolled at Faith Academy, largest MK school in the world. And on one morning, Gary pushed the large gates open to drive their vehicle out to take their kids up to Faith Academy early in the morning. He didn't know that when he pushed the gate open, there were 4 armed thieves that raced into the compound. And they began to look through the ABW office and guest house for loot. And while they were searching, Gary was able to separate himself from them and get to a telephone and very quickly and quietly dialed our number and said, "Kent, we're at the guest house. We are being robbed and the thieves are still here. Call the police." So I hung up and dialed 166, the equivalent of 911 in the Philippines. And the phone rang and nobody answered on the other end. I thought I misdialed. I tried again, 166. And the telephone just continued to ring with no answer at the other end. The thought occurred, try 911. Maybe they make international calls. I finally called the municipal police in Mandaluyong, where our office is located, and they dispatched a SWAT team that arrived minutes after the thieves had left. After talking with the police, Kelly and I raced out, jumped into our car, and drove the 12-mile distance from Parañaque, where we were living on the south suburb of Manila, to Mandaluyong, which is in the center of the city. 12 miles. Took us over 2 hours to arrive because of the unimaginable traffic congestion that characterizes metropolitan Manila. The frustration of unavailability. We felt it on that day. And that's what we cause to the heart of Jesus Christ when we are prejudiced toward other people groups. Lord, not them. Whereas prejudice is a hindrance to the gospel penetrating all nations, Jesus here in John chapter 4 models the universality of God's grace. And God give us that perspective on people, both near and far. Secondly, not only is prejudice a hindrance to availability, not them, but preoccupation is also an obstacle to availability. Preoccupation is an obstacle to availability. And we can summarize this point again in 2 words. Not that. Not that. Not witnessing, not disciple making, not teaching. Not that. Now, I have to admit that I am convinced that there was a Filipino amongst the original group of 12 disciples. You laugh, all right? Hear me out on this. There was a Filipino, because it was the Filipino who spoke up here in verses 31 to 34. Let's see what he had to say. Verse 31, meanwhile his disciples urged him, "Rabbi, eat something." It was the Filipino that said that. It's a ministry occupational hazard in Asia. Anytime you are with other Asians, food is involved. It's a ministerial hazard. Banks can verify that. And it was the Filipino that spoke up, "Lord, let's eat something." Seriously, moving on. But he said to them, "I have food to eat that you know nothing about." And then his disciples said to each other, could someone have brought him food? My food, said Jesus, is to do the will of him who sent me and to finish his work. Rabbi, eat something. They were preoccupied with lunch. We have already discovered they've just returned from Sychar. The warm bread is already cooling. Eating was next on their agenda, and nothing was going to interrupt or detain them from that. What's on your schedule this week? What's on your agenda? Any appointments with people? We're going to identify 3 names tonight, aren't we? And we need to prioritize appointments, get them on our schedule, our agenda. Think of creative ways to connect with them, whether it be around your dining room table. Great ministry happens there. Or another venue. Eating was next on their schedule. I want you to see, hold on to that thought. I want you to see how the Samaritan woman's schedule and agenda dramatically changed at this point. First of all, we read in verses 6 and 7 that she came to the well as a consumer of water, drawing water to take back home. She returned to Sychar in verse 28 as a provider of living water. The Samaritan woman, first of all, forgot her purpose. Secondly, she also forgot her possession. Look at verse 28. And again, this comes across with all the impact of a footnote. Then simply leaving her water jar behind, she went back into town, said to the people. She forgot her purpose to draw water. She forgot her possession. She came to the well to draw water, and she forgot to take her clay water pot home with her. But most impactful, thirdly, not only did she forget her purpose, her possession, but she forgot her pride. What time did the woman go to the well according to verse 6 earlier in the text? What time was it? Good. The 6th hour. So what time is that? 6 o'clock? No. The Jewish way of reckoning time started at sun up, at dawn. And so the 6th hour was 12 o'clock noon when she went to the well to draw water. Now, Asians immediately get this point because many of them, as kids and teens, made that daily trek to the community well to fetch water. That's what they call running water. Thank you. I hate it when I have to explain those. They draw water and they run with it back in the plastic jugs to town. But she goes to the well at 12 noon when the sun is high and hot. That's ridiculous. No one goes to the well at that hour. Why would she go to the well at a time when no one else was drawing water at the well? Well, we've already commented upon that. Later on, Jesus reveals to her, right in the middle of their conversation, about her sinful lifestyle. And I'm confident that he was compassionate but firm when he pointed out the fact that, listen, I know. Believe me, I know you've been married 5 times. And the guy that you're living with now, you're not even married to him. She went to the well when no one else was at the well because she didn't want to have to talk with anyone. She was the topic of gossip in Sychar. And now she forgets her purpose. She forgets her possession. But listen to this. She forgets her pride and she turns and races back into Sychar, verse 28, to announce, come now and see a man who's told me everything I've ever done. Could this be him, the Messiah? She forgot her purpose. She forgot her possession. She forgot her pride. The disciples, on the other hand, remembered their food. Master, let's eat. Preoccupation with the physical, the temporal, the menial robs us of golden opportunities to make a spiritual impact as witnesses, as disciple makers, as teachers for the Lord Jesus Christ. Preoccupation is an obstacle to availability, not that. And whereas preoccupation is an obstacle to the gospel reaching all people, Jesus here emphasizes the priority of the gospel in verses 31 to 34. Rabbi, eat something. He said to them, I have food to eat that you know nothing about. Trust me on this one. The two pronouns that are there in verse 32 are emphatically in opposition to one another. Let me restate the verse and draw that out. Gentlemen, his disciples, I have food to eat that, quite frankly, you know nothing about. And that stirred a conversation, a quiet conversation amongst them. Who brought him food? Who catered this meal? Did he bring a sack lunch? What fast food restaurant has he visited while we were gone to get bread? And then he says this, my food, verse 34, is to do the will of him who sent me and to finish his work. Are you, on a routine, regular basis, enjoying the satisfying, fulfilling experience of doing God's will and participating in his work? It's delicious. And if that's not a part of your regular diet, we're probably characterized as being spiritually malnourished, sick, and weak. Preoccupation is an obstacle to the gospel reaching all people. Years ago, I'm not going to apologize for the date of the illustration. Wait till you see this. Years ago, nearly 20 years ago, on April the 25th of 2003, the Portland Trail Blazers were playing the Dallas Mavericks in the first round of the NBA playoffs. All right, the Mavericks had won the first two games. That makes no difference to the point that I want to emphasize today. But they were in the Rose Garden in Portland, Oregon, and a packed crowd of 20,000 spectators had crammed into the arena. 13-year-old Natalie Gilbert had won the privilege of singing the national anthem that night through a statewide contest there in the state of Oregon. She arrived early, beautiful voice, and she had flawlessly rehearsed the anthem again 5 times down in the solitude of her private locker room. The buzzer sounded to indicate the conclusion of warm-up. The Trailblazers, the Mavericks, they retreated to their respective benches, and Natalie received her cue to go to center court and to sing the national anthem. Just a couple lines into the song, she froze. She forgot the words. And the only thing that interrupted the silence were the indoor pyrotechnics that were designed to accentuate the singing of the national anthem. And as the fireworks continued to explode, the singer fizzled at mid-court. Watch as we replay that moment and watch what happens at that moment.
And now to honor America and salute the men and women serving our country with our national anthem, please welcome, as voted by you, the fans, our winner of the Toyota Get the Feeling of a Star promotion, Natalie Gilbert.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light the stars like stars.
Starlight's last
Stars like
dream,
last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight. Oh, the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets red glare, and the singing air gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave? Oh, the land of the free and the home of the brave.
I want to thank the worship team for leading us in worship this morning. That was beautiful, and I sincerely enjoyed that. They, perhaps better than any of the others of us, can appreciate the frustration of unavailability, and there was no place for that little girl to hide. She's 32 years old. This past week, I watched the video clip. Media circled back around to her, and they talked to her about that moment. She's a singer today. She's a songwriter, very accomplished musician. On that day, she was devastated. And appearing from the bench of the Portland Trailblazers comes Coach Maurice Cheeks, who has a Christian testimony, by the way. And he put his arm around that little girl, and he led her in a comeback. That guy can coach. Now, I got to tell you also, to be fair, he cannot sing. All right? He struggled to reach the high notes and strained to stay on tune, but his rendition of the national anthem on that day was the sweetest melody that Natalie Gilbert has ever heard in her life. And he led that little girl to a comeback. Did you see the end of the song? Or the land of the free and the home of the brave. They muted her mic, and she looked up into his eyes and said, "Thank you. Thank you." He stepped way outside of his comfort zone to do that. That guy can coach. Now, they lost the basketball game to go down 3-0 in the series. Portland won the next 3 games to force a 7th and deciding game and got beat. Portland went fishing for the rest of the year while the Dallas Mavericks moved on in the NBA play. I don't care about any of that. That is my lifetime sporting highlight right there. Maurice Cheeks leading Natalie Gilbert in a comeback. I'm seeing tears. I'm seeing Kleenexes being pulled out of purses right now. So I know for a fact that you, right now, right here, are experiencing the frustration of unavailability when the words were not there. That's exactly what we cause to the heart of Jesus Christ when we are preoccupied with menial tasks and we miss the priorities. Prejudice is a hindrance, not that. Preoccupation is a barrier to taking the gospel to the nations. Not them, not that. Whereas preoccupation is an obstacle to the gospel reaching all people, Jesus here emphasizes the priority of the gospel in verses 31 to 34. And lastly, the third barrier, none of them slowed Jesus from ministering to the Samaritan. The disciples of his day, the followers of Christ today, we continue to trip and stumble over them. What's the third? Procrastination. Procrastination is a barrier to availability. What's the two-word summarization? Not time. We get the misled notion that there'll be a later, better opportunity to get serious about our responsibility to be a witness, to connect with that neighbor, with that coworker, with that teammate. We presume that there'll be a later, better opportunity. And this is what Jesus had to say about it in verse 35. In the opinion, first of all, of the disciples, we read in verse 35, Jesus saying, do you not say, here's their opinion, 4 more months and then the harvest. And then we see Jesus' opinion of the harvest, but I tell you, open your eyes and look at the fields, plural. That's a hint about what he's talking about, for they are ripe for harvest. King James Version puts it, they are white unto harvest. And that's perplexed Bible commentators, because there's no crop that's white when it's ripe that's produced in Israel. Don't raise cotton in Israel. So what in the world is he talking about? Our family, really a trip of a lifetime, was able to travel with a supporting church on a Holy Land tour, Israel, for 10 days. And I think that we saw what Christ is referring to here in verse 35. Because today, just like back 2,000 years ago in his day, the Arabs, the Jews, the nomadic herdsmen, they continued to wear the light-colored, the white flowing gowns that radiate the heat of the Mediterranean sun, helps them to stay cool as they're out working with their flocks and their herds. I don't think he was talking about plants or produce at all. I think he was referring to people. And in my mind's imagination, this is how I picture verse 35. Jesus and the disciples are standing beside a planted field that in 4 months it was going to be ready for harvest. But then he gestures back down the road that the Samaritan woman had raced back into Sychar. And now here they come. The residents of Sychar, you say 4 more months and the field will be ready for harvest. I say unto you, lift up your eyes, look upon the fields. And here they come. They're ready for harvest. Look at the context. Verse 28, she's racing back into town. Verse 30, here she comes with all of her neighbors from Sychar to meet Jesus. Verse 40, Jesus spends a couple days teaching the residents of Sychar. He's not talking about a plant or produce. He's referring to people. Preoccupation is a barrier to availability when we presume it's not time. And whereas preoccupation is a barrier to the gospel impacting our generation, Jesus appeals here in verse 35 to the urgency of our witness in taking the gospel to those near and far. There they are. Which of those do you and I struggle with? The barriers, the hindrances, the obstacles to availability. Have we laid hold of the fact that we need to displace that prejudice with compassion and mercy and grace? Have we displaced our preoccupation with temporal things with an understanding of the priority value on the gospel? Have we replaced that misguided notion that there'll be a later, better opportunity to get serious about our witness with a true understanding of the urgency of the gospel? We've sang about it today. We've seen it illustrated from John chapter 4, and we need to put feet to that. Footprints of the Great Commission that are embedded in the nail prints of his great compassion. That's what motivated Jesus to take the shortcut through Samaria. And that's the only thing that will motivate us to connect with our neighbors. I think Chris and Deb were there with us in 2014 when the Philippine Association of Baptists for World Evangelism celebrated with much fanfare the 50th anniversary of the first Filipino missionaries being sent from our Association of Churches in the Philippines as Asian missionaries to Thailand. It was a big deal. And the original missionaries were there. Dr. Roberto and Barbara Higliana, good, close friends of mine. Had a number of conversations with them. Retired. Roberto is now with the Lord. But they were there on that day celebrating. The vision of ABWE for the Great Commission is this: to fulfill the Great Commission by multiplying leaders and churches and mission movements. The commission is not only for the North American church, it's for every nation. As they are reached, discipled, churches planted, churches banded together, arm in arm, deploying missionaries around the globe. We need to change the whole paradigm of missions, where we think that all the personnel and the resources and the strategy are emanating from North. No. We will never get the job done if that's how we look at missions. It's this fellowship of churches, and that one in Europe, and this one down under in Australia, and churches in Asia deploying missionaries around the globe. And so we had the Philippine Association of Baptists for World Evangelism. They pronounce it as a word, as an acronym, PABWE, sending Filipinos to Thailand. And then, after about 15 years, the first Thai missionaries were sent across the border as TABWE missionaries, Thailand Association of Baptists for World Evangelism, into Cambodia. Did you catch what I just said? 3 generations of Bible-believing Baptists committed to the Great Commission and getting involved in it. And that's what we were there to celebrate in 2014. All right, that next photo. This is John and Not Pontowit. They are Aka tribal leaders, and they're the 25 Aka leaders that he's trained, dressed in tribal regalia. They were there as another target group, a subculture, an unreached people group, that in 1992, Filipino missionaries, it was not ABWE, Filipino missionaries serving with PABWE specifically targeted the Aka in northern Thailand for Great Commission ministry. I'm going to quote to you as I conclude John's testimony that he shared on that day. He said this is near verbatim. PABWE targeted us in 1992. Until that time, we received no government services, medical, educational, from the Thai government. We could not own land. We were not even regarded as citizens of Thailand. They were perceived as a non-people, as less than human. But PABWE targeted us, brought the gospel, made disciples, and now we are citizens of heaven. And the auditorium, it just erupted in applause. And then he continued with those leaders standing behind him. He said in 2008, God gave me a vision for multiplying and training other Aka leaders to shepherd churches and to plant churches and to serve as missionaries. And today there are more than 24 Aka churches in northern Thailand. There are several that have been planted among the Lahu people, among the Karen people. There are Aka churches that these guys have planted over in Myanmar, in Laos, and in China. And whoa, I thought the roof was going to go off at that point with the applause. In contrast to what we've talked about today, the impact, the frustrating impact of prejudice and preoccupation and presumption, that's what it looks like when we replace those things with a compassionate obedience to the Great Commission. And the gospel penetrates the nations.